right, new sermon series today. Be reading to you to kick us off from the book of Genesis, in the beginning of the Bible. This is from the 18th chapter, starting in verse 1 through 8. The Lord appeared to Abraham by the oaks of Mamre, as he sat at the entrance of his tent in the heat of the day. He looked up and saw 3 men standing near him. When he saw them, he ran from the tent entrance to meet them and bowed down to the ground. He said, "My Lord, if I find favor with you, do not pass by your servant. Let a little water be brought, and wash your feet, and rest yourselves under the tree. Let me bring a little bread that you may refresh yourselves, and after that you may pass on, since you have come to your servant." So they said, "Do as you have said." And Abraham attended into his tent to Sarah and said, "Make ready quick 3 measures of choice flour. Knead it and make cakes." Abraham ran to the herd and took a calf, tender and good, and gave it to the servant, who hastened to prepare it. Then he took curds and milk and the calf that he had prepared, and he set it before them. And he stood by them under the tree while they ate. And a second reading from the New Testament. This is from 1 Peter chapter 4, verse 8. Above all, maintain constant love for one another, for love covers a multitude of sins. The word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God. Today, just north of downtown Seattle, there is a special building. If you walk into the building, you'd see several different apartments within this building. Each apartment is fairly small. It's a living room, a kitchen, and a bedroom. But it's very well appointed. Nice comfy pillows, new couches to sit on, a fridge stocked with food and snacks. There's television and stereo in the corner. The window overlooks a very picturesque lake. And in the distance at night, you can see the twinkling of the downtown Seattle skyline. These rooms and apartments look very much like any other that you might rent if you did an Airbnb, for instance. And you walked into this place and you'd say, "This feels like a comfortable place to relax, to kick back, and to spend a few days." But the guests at this place come and they stay for a few days, but they don't leave the apartment. And if you were to look closely, you'd see that important points in the apartment are mounted on the walls, discreetly, video cameras. 3 of them, to be exact. Now, this may sound like countless reality TV shows setups, where you're going to put couples into these different apartments, and you're just going to see what happens. In some ways, I suppose that's true. That is what happens. But this place is called the Love Lab. And it's called the Love Lab, not the Love Lab, okay? It's the Love Lab. And this is a place that a psychologist team, a husband and wife team, named John and Julie Gottman, who are really the pioneer gurus of couples therapy work. They have put this together as their life's work, and one of their main projects is to put together this complex where they and other teams of psychologists are able to take in couples and to study them, to watch them closely, to watch their every single move, to document that, and to try to figure out an answer to a simple but an all-important question, which is, what is it that helps couples stay together and stay in love for a lifetime? Is there something that can be done? Now, John Gottman's background really comes more from business and statistics, mathematician, that kind of angle. But he found himself far more interested as he went through graduate school in psychology, and so he took his expertise in one area and his new love for another area and tried to overlay them and say, is there something that can be found? Can we crack the code, if that's possible, on how to really study love and relationships and how we can help partnerships last for a lifetime? And so they believe that they have come up with not just an idea about how this works, but very practically, and this is one of the things I like about the Gottmans, they come up with 7 practical steps that they believe that, if done, will help couples find this kind of marital satisfaction. And so over the next few weeks, we're going to be spending some time talking about those 7 principles. I'm going to preach a handful of sermons. Stephen is going to preach a couple of those sermons. Some of you are going to go off on the couples retreat midway through this series, and we hope that this will be enriching to all of us. Now, why are we doing this? Well, first and foremost, because you may recall that our church's mission statement is about strengthening families. And now we don't ever put any kind of emphasis on what that family looks like. There's families of all shapes and sizes. But we're talking about strengthening families by making and growing highly committed disciples of Jesus Christ for the transformation of the world. And one of the ways that we do that is by looking at interpersonal relationships, relationships between partners, relationships within families, relationships within friendships, and of course, there will also be plenty in this series about our relationship with God and the spiritual part of this relationship as well. So with that in mind, we're gonna dive into this. But I think it's also important to just remember that as Christians, the foundational piece of what makes faith is essentially a relationship. I mean, you can't have faith independent of relationships. And so that's absolutely key to everything that we talk about. It's our relationship with God. It's our relationship to others. It's about how we are called to live our lives, not as lone wolf Christians, but as people who are in relationship constantly with our Creator, with one another, and with the world around us. So that's why we're diving into this. That's why we're going to be looking at this. And that's why we're going to be talking about these 7 principles, which come out of a book that I've stolen the title of, called The Love Prescription, that came out just last year. So here's how it works. The Gottmans gathered these couples, newlywed couples, and not just a few couples, but 130 different couples came through the Love Lab. And it does, I mean, I'll give you this. Let's just name the sort of the elephant in the room. It sounds a little creepy, I'll be honest. It sounds a little creepy. Hey, let's get newlyweds and put cameras all over the place. I get it. But the idea was you have to start at the beginning of a marriage and of a relationship and watch this and begin to track it. Is there something that can be discovered in this process? And they were looking at first for big things, like what happens when the couple gets into an argument? I mean, if people, when they're in their early months or years of marriage, get into a major argument, is that some sort of a precursor for things to come? How do they fight? Do they fight fair? What's that like? What is it? Look at things like ages and interests and things like that. How do they spend their free time? What do they talk about when they talk? These were sort of the big things that they were looking at early on. But as they began to look very closely at the videos and play them back over and over again, they began to notice something far more small than that, but maybe the most significant of all. They noticed that all people in relationships, and couples obviously, and maybe in particular, do small things that try to get the other person's attention. Very small things. And they call those bids. Now, if you did go on the marriage retreat last winter, you may remember that we spent some time talking about bidding, and we talked about the Gottmans, and because again, they are kind of the ultimate sort of marriage counselor type folks out there right now and very well respected. But bids are those tiny little things where we do something to try to engage someone else, and in this case, a partner, right? And so it would be not necessarily big things. Like a bid isn't necessarily, hey, Eleanor, I came home and I'm surprising you with 2 tickets on a cruise and we're leaving tomorrow, pack your bags, isn't this romantic, right? Now that would be a heck of a bid, I suppose, from me to my wife, but that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about things that are far smaller, even much more subtle. Imagine this, a couple sitting on the couch in their living room. Both of them doing what I think happens in so many of our homes, each on their phone, scrolling through whatever they want to scroll through. At home, I'm looking at sports scores that I probably don't even care about that much. Eleanor's looking at Facebook things and weird 30-second videos that she doesn't care about that much. And one of us says to the other, well, that's interesting. That is a bid. Another bid might happen she sits down at the dinner table. Maybe it's one of those nights that all four of us are seated around the table together. And we sit down, we say the blessing, we start to eat, and she goes, that is a bid. I walk by her as I get up from the couch, and I run my finger along the back of her shoulder as I make my way out to the kitchen for a snack. That is a bid. And bids are often those little, tiny, subtle things. But they are when whoever is doing the bidding is saying to their partner or to whoever they're in the room with, I am trying to engage you in some form or fashion. As I say, hey, that's interesting, and I may be reading about some college kid just did the longest punt in NCAA history, and it's interesting to me, but I'm telling her because I'm trying to engage her in something, right? She sighs at the dinner table, and that means something if it's audible enough for me to hear it. If I run my finger on her shoulder as I walk out of the room, that's me communicating with her in some way. So these are all different forms of bids. The key then is how we respond to those bids. And the Gottmans say there are three types of ways that we respond to the bids. One is that we turn towards the bid and the bidder, right? So turning towards would be, that's interesting. And she says, what's interesting? I'm curious. You piqued my interest. What is it? And I tell her about the punter, right? And she says, well, that wasn't that interesting, but we've made contact, right? It's a bid. It's a bid. The next thing, she sighs at the dinner table. I turn towards her and I say, well, that was a heavy sigh. Tell me more about your day, right? And then I run my finger on her shoulder and she says, hey, hon, can you grab me something while you're up too? And when you come back, let's talk, right? Okay, so those are turning toward. The next thing, the other option is turning away from the bids. That's just basically ignoring the bid. That's interesting. And she says, oh my gosh, she's probably gonna tell me about football, right? And she doesn't say anything because she's immersed in what she's doing. And to be fair, we all do that too, right? We've all done that. Somebody sighs and it's like, I don't know what she's sighing about, but we're eating and we're gonna, well, you get it. You touch me on the shoulder, he must want something, I'm not gonna respond, right? So all of those things could be turning away. And then there's the final kind of response, which is the turn against. And that's the most destructive kind, right? That's the, I know you're bidding, I want nothing to do with it. That's interesting. Oh my gosh, please don't tell me about sports. I am so over it. I don't know what that was about, but please, we're trying to have a pleasant conversation. Don't bring your negativity from today into it. Right? Touch me. Right? She recoils at the touch. That's turning against. And the Gottmans observed in the Love Lab that as they watched these videos, they saw these behaviors over and over and over again. And they weren't these grandiose gestures. They were just little tiny subtle things. But the subtle things added up. And they found that the subtle things matter. The subtle things matter most. Most. They kept in touch with these 130 couples for 6 years. They didn't keep them in the Love Lab 6 years. That was just a weekend. But they tracked these couples checking in, significant events, first anniversaries, a death in the family, a baby's born. They checked in with them all along the way. And after 6 years, they went back to these couples, and here's what they found out. That the couples who turned toward each other's bids only 33% of the time at the Love Lab. So in other words, they're watching on the cameras in the Love Lab, they're watching the bids, and the couples who responded positively to the bids only 1/3 of the time were now divorced. The couples that had the most thriving, harmonious, vital marriages turned to each other's bids affirmatively 86% of the time at the Love Lab. So put very plainly, when your spouse sighs, when they say, that's interesting, when they say, hey, can we talk? When they say, would you like to watch a show together? When they say, I read an interesting article, it's best if we take an interest. Even if that's not exactly where we're at in the moment, our partner is making a bid towards us in that moment that we are being not necessarily called to care about a football article, but our partner is making contact. They're making a connection. They desire a closeness, and that's what it's all about. And the results are staggering. And even the Gottmans said, we were floored by the results of this because there is rarely a time in a scientific study that you find that kind of disparity between something that went so wrong and something that went so right. 86% and 33%. In the Genesis story that I read a moment ago, you may remember this story. Abraham and Sarah are in their home, probably this tent compound out in the wilderness. They've got their extended family and community there, and these visitors come by. Now, the Hebrew code would suggest that out of hospitality and an obligation to be hospitable to your neighbors and to strangers and anybody who's a passerby, that they would extend some sort of hospitality. But this is kind of going over and above. Abraham sees these visitors, these three mysterious figures. Later we find out that maybe they're God in some form, or maybe they're angels, or maybe they're just ambassadors sent from God. But these three people show up, and Abraham bows to them, says, hey, sit, rest your feet, grab a towel, I'll bring you some water, let's water your animals. I'm gonna go have my wife prepare some food, I'm gonna go grab a goat, and we're gonna celebrate the fact that you are here. Refresh yourself before you pass on. It is a gift, it is a blessing that you have come to visit my family and I as passersby. God is making a bid in this story by showing up at Abraham and Sarah's door. And Abraham turns toward. He responds affirmatively to that bid. And he says, I'm going to go out of my way. I'm going to provide everything I can for you because you are a blessing to me. Abraham does this wholeheartedly, sincerely, and not expecting anything in return, but we know that this strengthens now the relationship between the visitors and the host family. And this will lead to a further blessing that involves a baby, it involves a return visit, and you may remember how the rest of that story goes. But the point is that here we have in the very beginning of the Bible a story about God making a bid to a human family. And they respond by turning towards, and it yields wonderful results. The other passage was from 1 Peter. Extend in showing love and grace to one another because it covers a multitude of sins. That's another thing that we're going to talk about over the next few weeks is that this research over and over again continues to say that don't focus on what's going wrong. Instead, double down on the things that you can do right. The Gottmans at another weekend retreat put people in a workshop, and they said one half of the couple is going to be there the whole weekend, and they're going to talk about things that are going well in the relationship and how to build upon those things, how to leverage those things in your relationship. And then day 2, we're going to talk about some of the things that are going wrong and how we might help with that. And then they took a second part of the group and just made them come to day 2, the part that went wrong. And they found similar wide-ranging results in terms of the couple that was there for the whole weekend ended up having a far more harmonious weeks that followed that than the ones that just went to talk about what was going wrong. And so we're going to talk about how we can help with the things that we can control that are a little bit easier. Let's work on adding goodness to the things that are already good. Let's take things like bids and talk about how to respond to them rather than talk about the old fights and opening the old wounds again. But there's a part of this too that talks about God's love for us. That bidding is a part of what God does. And the Bible, of course, never uses that language. That's psychology language, but it's really the same. It's interesting that on Friday this past week, we celebrated the church's holy day of Epiphany. That's the 12th day of Christmas. It's the day that we celebrate that the wise men arrived at baby Jesus' manger because they had a long walk. The shepherds, they came a few hundred yards. The wise men, they came maybe a few hundred miles. And by the time that they got there, they were recognizing and responding to God's newest bid to the world in the form of God made flesh, baby Jesus. And what's so powerful about this story is that the lowest ranking people in society, the shepherds, came to be by his side. And the Gentiles, the non-Jews, and people of pretty noble stature were also there and responding to the bid that God made to humanity. So the challenge now is to recognize the bids that are out there. Because there are bids taking place around us at all times. Bids from our partners, bids from our friends who write us a note, who send us a Christmas card, who text us out of the blue, who make a random phone call. How will we respond? We talk about bids from God, whether that's a gentle, still whisper, a nudge, a poke, a divine spark within us, a sacred echo, a wink. All of these terms that we use that basically are talking about the same thing. Those moments that we feel like maybe God is coming a little closer right now and making a bid. But the choice is ours. In marital relationships, in friendships, in familial relationships, and holy relationships. When the bid comes, will we turn toward? Will we turn away? Or will we turn against? I invite you to have your radars up. Be watching for those bids, because the evidence and the research shows that the bids matter, and how we respond matters even more in relationships, in faith, in all our life. May we have our radars up. Will you pray with me?